Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats. Our program is about to begin. The National Endowment for the Humanities is pleased to welcome you to the 2017 Jefferson Lecture in the Humanities at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. During the program, we ask that you silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. Flash photography is not allowed. We also request that you do not ask the lecturer to sign books or give autographs. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise and remain standing for the presentation of the colors by the Joint Armed Forces Color Guard and our national anthem. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, William Adams.
Thank you. Good evening. On behalf of the National Endowment for the Humanities, I'm very pleased and proud to welcome you to the 2017 Jefferson Lecture in the Humanities. I'd like to start by thanking the supporters of tonight's lecture. As he has done so often in the past, our good friend Albert Small, one of Washington's most ardent humanities benefactors, made a substantial gift to NEH in support of this year's lecture. He was joined in this effort. Thank you. He was joined in this effort by the members of the National Trust for the Humanities. I want particularly to thank Bob Perry, the chairman of the Trust, for his close attention to this year's lecture, including his encouragement of the Kovler Fund of the Community Foundation for the National Capital Region, which also provided support for this year's lecture, as it has in the past. Also, as they have in the past, we're grateful to Paul L. Peck and to the President's Committee on the Arts and the Humanities. Last, but certainly not least among our donors, I want to acknowledge the support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for its significant gift. The Mellon Foundation is a long-standing partner and friend of the NEH in funding humanities research, education, and public initiatives around the country, and it's especially gratifying to recognize the Foundation's help with the lecture this year. Finally, I'd like to express our appreciation to the staff members of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and the staff members of NEH for their excellent work in planning and staging this important event. Please join me in thanking all of these individuals and organizations. This is the 46th year of the Jefferson Lecture, the highest honor bestowed by the National Endowment for the Humanities. This free public lecture is also the endowment's most widely attended and watched event, in keeping with the charge expressed in our founding legislation that the humanities belong to all of the people of the United States. In addition to all of you here tonight in the audience, we welcome those viewing the live stream on NEH's website. Tonight, we're extremely pleased and proud to welcome to this place and to this important event the distinguished political and moral philosopher Martha C. Nussbaum, Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago. As someone trained in political philosophy and as a reader of her work over many years, I was excited to place the call last July to Professor Nussbaum, inviting her to be the Jefferson Lecturer this year. That was a long time ago. But now, nearly 10 months later, the choice seems even more appropriate and fitting. Professor Nussbaum is one of the most, thank you. Thank you. Professor Nussbaum is one of the most accomplished political and moral philosophers of our time. Her productivity is legendary, some 20 books and hundreds of articles. But much more impressive to me than this prodigious output is the intellectual range of her work. Professor Nussbaum has thought and written extensively about writers of Greek and Roman antiquity, an interest she continues to cultivate, as we will learn tonight. Many in this room know of her stirring defense of the humanities and of liberal education. She has written extensively and meaningfully on women's rights and gender equality, economic development, animal rights, on India, human sexuality, on constitutional law, religion and religious violence, intolerance and toleration, and political emotions. There is almost no domain of political and moral life and thought that her work and apparently endless curiosity have not explored. In the midst of all this mental exercise, Martha Nussbaum also somehow finds time to be a serious runner and to sing opera. These are not mere hobbies. They are serious commitments that surface in her work and her attention to the importance of the human body, health, and artistic expression, to what she calls human flourishing, a concept that grounds virtually everything she has written. Her productivity and impact on philosophy and social theory has led to many honors and awards, including more than 50 honorary degrees at colleges and universities in the United States and abroad. Professor Nussbaum is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society, an academician in the Academy of Finland, and a Fellow of the British Academy. Her awards include the Grawemeyer Award in Education, the Centennial Medal of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University, the Prince of Asturias Prize in the Social Sciences, the American Philosophical Association's Philip L. Quinn Prize, and just this past year, the Kyoto Prize in Arts and Philosophy. At NEH, of course, we view her selection as this year's Jefferson Lecturer as the summit of this mountain of recognition. Professor Nussbaum's most recent work has been devoted to the subject of the political emotions. Against the backdrop of the grand tradition of Western political theory, this turn in her work is especially important. There have, of course, been other writers in that tradition who've been interested in the emotional dimensions of political life. Some of the writers of Greek and Roman antiquity, as we'll hear tonight, of course, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Johann Herder in more recent European political thought, and most recently, her teacher, John Rawls. But as she points out in her 2013 book, Political Emotions, the Western tradition of theory for much of its time, including liberal political theory, liberal democratic theory, especially, has been thin on the emotions and long on the role of reason in politics. The opening up and examination of the emotional dimension of politics is long overdue, and it is also liberating. We can't really understand the present state of our political lives without a grasp of the political emotions that animate them. Professor Nussbaum wishes to restore the fundamental importance of the emotional landscape within our politics and to know more deeply the particular emotions that give our political culture its energy, its meaning, and its definition. Not all political emotions are good emotions, of course, and as we will learn tonight, Professor Nussbaum has plenty to say about how some emotions, particularly anger, fear, envy, and shame, can become destructive forces in politics, particularly in democratic societies. But even more important, I think, is the role that political emotions play in creating the kind of world that we should aspire to live in. Professor Nussbaum is an unabashed advocate of a form of liberal democracy devoted to personal freedom, inclusion, equal dignity, and fairness. Establishing and maintaining such a society cannot be accomplished on the basis of rational consent alone. That work must also call upon and stimulate a transformational culture of emotions. Minimally, that culture includes the strong love of place and community we call patriotism, and the imaginative empathy and extended sympathy that lie at the heart of compassion. Recent political experience has given all of us a new and deeper awareness of the negative force of political emotions in our lives. In offering us a way to reach a more reflective understanding of that emotional register, Martha Nussbaum's project also achieves enormous local and contemporary relevance. But her project also holds out the prospect of transcending this difficult moment by turning our attention to the emotions that we should try to cultivate instead: respect, trust, and the form of love for our fellow citizens that undergirds both patriotism and the impulse toward justice. We learn from her work how hard this is, but we also see why it is worth doing and why we must try. By inserting us more deeply into the emotional culture that undergirds our current political practices, and by pointing us in the direction of another culture, more generous and humane, that might guide our institutions and practices, Martha Nussbaum brings into compelling contemporary form and profile the ancient ideal of philosophy as a kind of thinking that finds its fullest expression in the open and shared spaces of our public lives. In doing so, she offers us a model of what it means to be a public intellectual in this time, our time. And she also gives us a better view of why and how the humanities matter to the democratic aspirations and spirit of our country. That view is centered in her conviction that the country as a whole, the nation, has a profound interest and responsibility regarding the matter of how we form citizens. Specifically, Professor Nussbaum wants to know how we influence the emotional climate of our public culture in the interest of democratic citizenship. Influence, of course, is achieved in many places, official and unofficial, public and private. It thrives in formal educational settings, of course, but also in public rituals and festivals, in the public cultivation of symbols, and in the observance of the laws, to name just a few. But wherever it is exercised, influence of the democratic kind has common aims. It leads us more deeply into our shared history. It stirs our imaginations. It inclines us toward compassion, and it cultivates an understanding of our institutions and laws, our constitutional principles, and our fundamental freedoms and rights. As readers of Martha Nussbaum's book, Not for Profit, will recognize, these aims and outcomes of democratic emotional influence are also the key attributes of the humanities and humanities education. Democracy and the humanities are of the same cloth, and they have been so for us since the founding of the American Republic, arguably the greatest single public humanities moment in our history. Professor Nussbaum is careful to say that not every democratic impulse and influence should or could come from public institutions, including the state. But she also believes, as do many people I know in this hall, that the democratic polity, the nation, this nation, our nation, has a profound interest, in the deepest sense of that word, in promoting and supporting a flourishing humanities community in the United States, just as it has an interest in supporting flourishing artistic, scientific, and technological communities. Liberal democracy demands nothing less. Democracy's flourishing and the humanities flourishing are one and the same. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the 2017 Jefferson Lecture in the Humanities Professor Martha C. Nussbaum.
Chairman Adams, and all of you people out there that I can't even see your faces. It's a great honor to be invited to deliver the Jefferson Lecture with its long, impressive history and before such a distinguished audience. I want to thank all of you and the endowment for this gracious introduction and for the opportunity this lecture gives to me to speak as a humanist and on behalf of the humanities, which are now, I believe, more essential than ever. But before I begin, I would like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of an extremely distinguished humanist who died after a long illness on April 16th. Albert Henricks, at the time of his death, the Elliott Professor of Greek at Harvard, exemplified the very finest values in humanistic scholarship. A path-breaking scholar of ancient Greek religion, and particularly the cult of Dionysus, he also illuminated the relationship between paganism and Christianity. His work was technically brilliant, searchingly argued, and both punctilious and daring. As a professional colleague, he was generous to all, and he exhibited the spirit of justice and reconciliation, of which this lecture will speak. I told him shortly before his death that I would find an occasion to mention him tonight. and I do so with gratitude and deep affection. At the end of Aeschylus's Oresteia, two transformations take place in the city of Athens. One of these is famous and the other often neglected. In the famous transformation, Athena introduces legal institutions to replace and terminate the cycle of blood vengeance, setting up a court of law with established procedures of evidence and argument and a jury selected by lot from all the citizens of Athens. She announces that blood guilt will from now on be settled by law rather than by the Furies, ancient goddesses of revenge. But the Furies are not simply dismissed. Instead, Athena persuades them to join the city, giving them a place of honor beneath the earth in recognition of their importance for the health of the city. Now, typically, this move of Athena's is understood to be a recognition that the legal system must incorporate and honor the retributive passions. These passions themselves remain unchanged. They simply have a new house built around them. The Furies agree to accept the constraints of law, but they retain an unchanged nature, dark and vindictive. That reading, however, ignores the second transformation, a transformation in the character of the Furies themselves. As the drama begins, the Furies are described as repulsive and horrifying. They're said to be black and disgusting. Their eyes drip a hideous liquid. Apollo even says that they vomit up clots of blood that they've ingested from their prey. They belong, he says, in some barbarian tyranny where cruelty reigns. Nor, when they awaken, do the Furies give the lie to these grim descriptions. As the ghost of the murdered Clytemnestra calls them, they don't even speak, but they simply make animal noises, moaning and whining. The Greek says mygmos and oigmos. When they do begin to speak, their only words are, "Get him, get him, get him, get him, get him," as close to a predator's hunting cry as the genre allows. As Clytemnestra says, "In your dream, you pursue your prey, and you bark like a hunting dog hot on the trail of blood." If the Furies are later given poetic speech, as the genre demands, we're never to forget that initial characterization. What Aeschylus has done is to depict unbridled resentment. It is obsessive, destructive, existing only to inflict pain and ill. As the distinguished 18th century philosopher Bishop Butler says, "No other principle or passion hath for its end the misery of our fellow creatures." Apollo's idea is that this rabid breed surely belongs somewhere else, not in a law-abiding democracy. Unchanged, these Furies could not be at the foundation of a legal system in a society committed to the rule of law. You don't put wild dogs in a cage and come out with justice. However, the Furies do not make the transition to democracy unchanged. Until quite late in the drama, they are still their bestial selves, threatening to disgorge their venom on the land. But then, Athena persuades them to alter themselves so as to join her enterprise. "Lull to repose the bitter force of your black wave of anger," she tells them. But of course, that means a virtual change of identity. So bound up are they with anger's obsessive force. She offers them incentives to join the democracy, a place of honor, reverence from the citizens, but only if they adopt a new range of sentiments, substituting future-directed benevolence for retribution. Perhaps most fundamental of all, they must listen to the voice of persuasion. They accept her offer, and they express themselves, as Aeschylus puts it, with gentle-tempered intent. Each, they declare, should give generously to each in what they call a mindset of common love. Not surprisingly, they're transformed physically in related ways. They apparently assume an erect posture for the procession that concludes the drama, and they receive crimson robes from a group of citizen escorts. So they've become Athenians rather than beasts. Their very name is changed. They're now called the kindly ones, Humanities, rather than the Furies. This second transformation is just as significant as the first one, and indeed it's crucial to the success of the first one. Aeschylus shows that a democratic legal order can't just put a cage around retribution. It must fundamentally transform it from something hardly human, obsessive, bloodthirsty, to something human, accepting of reasons, something that protects life rather than threatening it. The Furies are still needed because this is an imperfect world and there always will be crime to be dealt with, but they are not wanted or needed in their original form. They must become instruments of justice and human welfare. The city is liberated from the scourge of vindictive anger which produces civil strife. In its place, the city gets forward-looking justice. Like modern democracies, the ancient Greek democracy had an anger problem. Read the historians and you will see some things that are not entirely remote. Individuals litigating obsessively against people they blame for having wronged them, groups blaming other groups for their lack of power, citizens blaming prominent politicians and other elites for selling out the dearest values of the democracy, other groups blaming foreign visitors or even women for their own political and personal woes. The anger that the Greeks and later the Romans knew all too well was an anger full of fear at one's own human vulnerability. The Roman philosopher Lucretius even says that all political anger is an outgrowth of fear, of the terror of each human infant who comes into the world helpless and, unlike all other animals, can do nothing on its own to get what it needs to stay alive. Lucretius sees that as life goes on, vulnerability continues or even increases, since the awareness of death hits us hard at some point, making us realize that we are helpless with respect to the most important thing of all. This fear, he says, makes everything worse, leading to political ills to which I'll return. But for now, let's focus on anger. The Greeks and the Romans saw a lot of anger around them, but as classical scholar William Harris says in his fine book, Restraining Rage, they did not embrace or valorize anger. They did not define manliness in terms of anger, and indeed, as with those Furies, they tended to impute anger to women, whom they saw as lacking in rationality. However much they felt and expressed anger, they waged a cultural struggle against it, seeing it as destructive of human well-being and democratic institutions. The very first word of Homer's Iliad is anger, the anger of Achilles that brought thousand-fold pains upon the Achaeans. And the Iliad's hopeful ending requires Achilles to give up his anger and to be reconciled with his enemy Priam, as both acknowledge the frailty of human life. I believe the Greeks and Romans are right. Anger is a poison to democratic politics, and it is all the worse when fueled by a lurking fear and a sense of helplessness. As a philosopher, I've been working on these ideas for some time, first in a 2016 book called Anger and Forgiveness, and now in a book in progress called The Monarchy of Fear, investigating the relationship between anger and fear. In my work, I draw not only on the Greeks and Romans, but also on some recent figures, as I will tonight, and I conclude that we should resist anger in ourselves and inhibit its role in our political culture. That idea, however, is radical and evokes strong opposition, for anger, with all its evident ugliness, is a popular emotion. Many people think it's impossible to care for justice without anger at injustice, and that anger should be encouraged as part of a transformative process. Many also believe that it's impossible for individuals to stand up for their own self-respect without anger, that someone who reacts to wrongs and insults without anger is spineless and downtrodden. Nor are these ideas confined to the sphere of personal relations. The most popular position in the sphere of criminal justice today is retributivism. That is the view that the law ought to punish wrongdoers in a manner that embodies the spirit of justified anger. And it's also very widely believed that successful challenges against great injustice need anger to make progress. Still, we may persist in our Aeschylean skepticism, remembering that recent years have seen 3 noble and successful freedom movements, all conducted in a spirit of non-anger, those of Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela. Surely, people who stood up for their own self-respect and that of others, and who did not acquiesce in injustice. I'll now try to argue that a philosophical analysis of anger can help us support these philosophies of non-anger, showing why anger is fatally flawed from a normative viewpoint, sometimes incoherent and sometimes based on bad values, and especially poisonous when people use it to deflect attention from real problems that they feel powerless to solve. Anger pollutes democratic politics and is of dubious value in both life and the law. I'll present my general view and then show its relevance to thinking well about the struggle for political justice, taking our own ongoing struggle for racial justice as my example. And I'll end by showing why these arguments make it urgent for us to learn from literature and philosophy, keeping the humanities strong in our society. So there are 6 parts that will come. So this is part 1, the roots of anger. So let's now return briefly to that baby that Lucretius so brilliantly described. Babies at birth don't have anger as such because anger requires causal thinking. Someone did something bad to me. Fairly soon, however, that idea creeps in. Those caretakers are not giving me what I desperately need. They did this to me. It's because of them that I'm cold, wet, and hungry. Experiences of being fed, held, and clothed quickly lead to expectations to demands. Instinctual self-love makes us value our own survival and comfort. But the self is threatened by others when they don't do what we want and expect. Psychoanalyst Melanie Klein refers to this emotional reaction in young children as persecutory anxiety, since it is indeed fear, but it's coupled with an idea of a vague threat coming from outside. So I would prefer to call it fear, anger, or even fear, blame. If we were not helpless, we would just go get what we need. But since we are initially helpless, we have to rely on others. They don't always give us what we need, and then we lash out, blaming them. Blame gives us a strategy. Now I'll enforce my will by raging and making a lot of noise. But it also expresses an underlying picture of the world. The world ought to give us what we demand. When people don't do that, they're bad. Protest and blame are positive in a sense. They construct an orderly, purposive world in which I'm an agent making demands. My life is valuable. Things ought to be arranged so that I'm happy and my needs are met. That hasn't happened, so someone must be blamed. But retributive anger all too often infects the thought of blame and even that of punishment. The people we blame ought to suffer for what they have done. Psychologist Paul Bloom has shown that retributive thinking appears very early in the lives of infants, even before they begin to use language. Infants are delighted when they see the so-called bad person who's a puppet who has snatched something from another puppet, beaten with a stick. Bloom calls this an early sense of justice. Well, I prefer to call it the internal furies that inhabit us all and that are not securely linked to real justice. The infant's idea looks like a version of the lex talionis, an eye for an eye, pain for pain. It's not hard to imagine that this crude idea of proportional payback does have an early and maybe even an evolutionary origin. It's a leap to call this an idea of justice, and I think we shouldn't make that leap. So, part 2, defining anger. Let's now fast forward to human adulthood. People now experience and express not just primitive anger, but full-fledged anger. But what is anger? Philosophers are very fond of definitions, which are useful to clear our heads, in this case, helping us to separate the potentially promising parts of anger from those that lead to nothing but trouble. And back to the Greeks, let me talk about Aristotle's definition, since more or less all the definitions of anger in the Western tradition are modeled on it. And in fact, those in Indian traditions, the only non-Western tradition I unfortunately know much about, are very similar. According to Aristotle, then, anger is a response to a significant damage to something or someone that one cares about, and a damage that the angry person believes to have been wrongfully inflicted. Aristotle adds that although anger is painful, it also contains within itself a pleasant hope for payback or retribution. So, significant damage pertaining to the things one cares most about and wrongfulness, those two elements seem both true and uncontroversial, and they've been validated by modern psychological studies. Those parts of anger can go wrong in specific and local ways. We might be wrong about who did the bad thing, or how significant it was, or whether it was done wrongfully rather than just accidentally. But those parts are often on target. More controversial, certainly, is the idea that an angry person wants some type of retribution, and that this is a conceptual part of what anger itself is. All the Western philosophers who talk about anger do include this wish as a conceptual element in anger. Still, we need to pause because it's not obvious. Now, we should understand that the wish for retribution can be a very subtle wish. The angry person doesn't need to wish to go and take revenge herself. She may simply want the law to punish the wrongdoer, or even some type of divine justice. Or, even more subtly, she may simply want that wrongdoer's life to go very badly in future. Hoping, for example, that that second marriage of your betraying spouse turns out to be a dismal failure. I think if we understand the wish in that broad way, Aristotle's right. Anger does contain a kind of strike-back tendency, and that's what distinguishes it from compassionate grieving. Contemporary psychologists who study anger empirically do agree with Aristotle in seeing this double movement in it from pain to hope for payback. We should understand, however, that those two parts of anger might come apart. We can feel outrage at the wrongfulness of an act or an unjust state of affairs without wanting payback for the wrong done to us. I'll be arguing that the outrage part is personally and socially valuable when our beliefs are correct. We need to recognize wrongful acts and protest them, expressing our concern for the violation of an important norm. And there's one species of anger, I believe, that is free of the retributive wish. Its entire content is, how outrageous that is, something must be done about that. I call this technical term I've invented transition anger because it expresses a protest, but it turns to face forward. It gets to work finding solutions rather than dwelling on the infliction of retrospective pain. Take parents and children. Parents often feel that children have acted wrongfully, and they are outraged. They want to protest the wrong and somehow to hold the child accountable. But they usually do not want or seek retributive payback. They rarely think, today at least, now you have to suffer for what you have done, as if that by itself was a fitting response. Instead, they ask themselves, what sort of reaction will produce future improvement in the child? Usually this will not be a painful payback, and it certainly is not going to obey the lex talionis, an eye for an eye. If their child hits a playmate, parents do not hit their child as if that were what you deserve. Instead, they choose strategies that are firm enough to get the child's attention and that express clearly that and how what the child did was wrong. And they give positive suggestions for the future, how to do things differently. So, loving parents typically have the outrage part of anger without the payback part where their own children are concerned whom they love. Now, that will be a clue to my positive proposal for democratic society, where I fear there's not quite that relationship of love for our fellow citizens. Retributive wishes, however, are a deep part of human nature, fostered by some parts of the major religions and by many societal cultures, although they have been denounced by religious and social radicals, from Jesus and the Buddha to Mohandas Gandhi. They may have served us well in a pre-social condition, deterring aggression, but the idea that pain is made good or assuaged by more pain, though extremely widespread, is a deceptive fiction. Killing the killer does not restore the dead to life, although the demand for capital punishment is endorsed by many families of victims as if it did somehow set things to rights. Pain for pain is an easy idea, but it's a false lure, creating more pain instead of rectifying the problem. As Gandhi said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. This wish for payback arises in all kinds of situations. Take divorce. Betrayed spouses often feel entitled to seek punitive divorce settlements and child custody arrangements as if that were somehow their due, and as if punitive payback somehow restored the balance of power or rescued their damaged dignity. But in real life, the function of payback is usually far less benign. Two people become locked in a struggle for pain focused on the past, and often inflicting great collateral damage on children and friends and family. In the end, the betrayer may get his comeuppance, so to speak. But what does that achieve? Typically, it does not improve the litigant's life going forward. By focusing obsessively on the past, she becomes closed to new possibilities, and she often becomes bitter and unpleasant. Retaliation is ugly, as Aeschylus shows us in his portrait of the Furies. What the payback seeker wants is future happiness and self-respect. Payback by itself never achieves that, and it usually makes the world a lot worse for all. But wait a minute, we all agree, don't we, that wrongful acts, if they are serious enough, should be punished, and punishment is typically painful. Yes, I think we should agree that punishment is often useful, but why and how? We might see punishment in a retributive spirit, as payback for what has already happened. That's the attitude I have been criticizing, and it does great social harm, leading to a gruesome pile-on-the-misery strategy, as if it really compensated for or undid the damages of crime. But there's a better attitude, more like that of the good parent in my example. We might try looking to the future and produce a better society, using punishment to express the value we attach to human life and safety, to deter other people from committing that crime, and we hope deterring that individual from committing another crime, or at least incapacitating him. If we think this way, however, trying to improve the future, we probably will have a lot of other thoughts before we get to punishment. Like that good parent, we will think that people don't do wrong nearly as often if they are basically loved and respected, if they have enough to eat, if they get a decent education, if they are healthy, and if they foresee a future of opportunity. So thinking about crime will lead us in the direction of designing a society in which fewer people have incentives to commit crime. When they do, despite our best efforts, we take that seriously for the sake of the future. Now, there's one more part to Aristotle's definition of anger. He says that anger is always a response not to any old kind of damage, but only to the type that he calls a down-ranking. Now, this doesn't seem to be true all the time. I can get angry at wrongs done to others without thinking of them as down-rankings of me. Later philosophers, in fact, held on to the other parts of Aristotle's definition, but dropped this restriction. Anger can be a response to any wrongful act, not just a status injury. Still, let's hold on to Aristotle's idea because it does cover surprisingly many cases of anger, as empirical researchers emphasize. This status idea is important because it is the one case, I think, where payback gives you exactly what you want. If what you are focused on is not the murder or the theft or the rape itself, but only the way it has affected your relative status in the social world, then, by pushing the wrongdoer relatively lower, you do automatically raise yourself up relatively higher. And since we're imagining that relative status, that zero-sum game, is all you care about, you needn't be worried that the underlying harms caused by the wrongful act have not been made good. If you're thinking only about relative status, then payback sort of makes sense. Many people do think this way, and that may help explain why payback is so popular and why people do not quickly conclude that it's an empty diversion from the task of fixing the future. What's wrong with the status idea? Focus on relative status was very common in ancient Greece. Indeed, it explains Achilles' anger when Agamemnon insults him by taking, so to speak, his woman away. Focus on status was common, too, at the founding of the United States, as Lin-Manuel Miranda's brilliant Hamilton reminds us all. Elaborate codes of honor and status led indeed to constant status anxiety and to many duels responding to purported insults to status. What's wrong with the obsession with status is that life is not all about reputation. It's about more substantial things: love, justice, work, family. We all know people today who are obsessed with what other people think of them, who constantly scan the internet to see who's been insulting them. Social media certainly encourage this obsession as people diss each other, count the number of likes some post of theirs has garnered, and so on. As we live more and more in the eyes of others, more and more of our lives come in for rating, up or down. But isn't this obsession with status a sign of insecurity? And doesn't it actually increase insecurity, since that person who scans the world for signs of disfavor is sure to find many? Equally important, isn't the obsession with status a diversion from more important values? Achilles had to learn how bad it was to destroy thousands of people on account of one insult. Aaron Burr never learned very much, it appears, but his example shows us what we forfeit when we take up his mindset of being obsessed with being in the room where it happens. Notice that obsession with relative status is quite different from a focus on human dignity or self-respect, since dignity belongs to everyone and people are equal in dignity. At least this is how we ought to think and usually do think. So dignity does not establish a hierarchy or a zero-sum ranking, and nobody would be tempted to suppose that inflicting humiliation on someone else would affect my human dignity. Dignity, unlike reputation, is equal and inalienable. Okay, section 3, 3 errors in anger. We're now ready to see 3 ways that anger can lead us astray. First, what I'll call the obvious errors. Anger can be misguided and guide us badly if it's based on wrong information about who did what to whom and about whether the bad act was really done wrongfully rather than just by accident, and also if it's based on a confused sense of importance. Aristotle already mentions people who get angry when someone forgets their name, and this familiar example is a case of overestimating the importance of what that person did. Since we're often hasty when we're angry, these errors occur often. Second is the status error. We also go wrong, I claim, if we think relative status is hugely important and focus on that to the exclusion of other things. This error is really a case of mistaking the importance of a particular value, but since it's so common and such a major source of anger, we have to single it out and give it a separate number. And then number 3, the payback error. Finally, we very often go wrong when we permit deeply ingrained retributive thoughts to take over, making us think that pain wipes out pain, death wipes out murder, and so on. In short, when we think that inflicting pain in the present fixes the past, we go wrong because that thought is a kind of irrational, magical thinking, and because it distracts us from the future, which we can change and often should. And now section 4, the fourth error in anger, helplessness and the just world. All these first 3 errors are common, not least in the political life. We get hold of the wrong story about who did what to whom. We blame individuals and groups for a large systemic problem that they didn't cause. We overestimate trivial wrongs and also sometimes underestimate important ones. We obsess about our own relative status or that of our group. We think that payback will solve the problems created by the original offense, even though it doesn't. But there is one thing more. We often impute blame even when there's no blame to be apportioned. The world is full of accidents. Sometimes a disaster is just a disaster. Sometimes illness and hardship are just illness and hardship. The medical profession can't keep us completely safe from disease and death, and the wisest and most just social policies will not prevent economic woes arising from natural disasters. But in our infantile monarchical way, we expect the world to be made for our service. It gratifies our ego and is in a deep sense comforting to think that any bad event is someone's fault. The act of pinning blame and pursuing the bad guy is deeply consoling. It makes us feel control rather than helplessness. Psychologists have done a lot of work on people's intuitive views of the way the world works, and they find that most people have a deep-rooted need to believe that our world is just. One aspect of this just world hypothesis is a tendency to believe that people who are badly off must have caused their own misery by laziness or bad conduct. But another related aspect of this just world belief is the need to believe that when we encounter loss and adversity, it isn't just loss, it's someone's wrongdoing, and we can somehow recoup our loss by punishing the bad guy. Your parent dies in the hospital. It's very human to believe the doctors did it and to deflect one's grief into malpractice litigation. Your marriage falls apart. Often there is fault around, but sometimes it can't be easily identified. Things do just fall apart. Still, it's human to fix blame on the bad spouse and try to crush that person with litigation. It makes life look more intelligible, the universe more just. Economic woes are sometimes caused by an identifiable person or person's malfeasance, and sometimes by clearly stupid or unfair policies. But often, too, their cause may be obscure and uncertain. We feel bad saying that. It makes the world look messy and ungovernable. So why not pin the blame, as the Greeks did, on groups that are easy to demonize? In place of their rhetorical category of barbarians, we might focus blame on immigrants, or women entering the workforce, or bankers, or rich people. The Salem witch trials were once thought to be the result of group hysteria among adolescent girls, but now we know that a preponderant number of the witch blamers were actually young men entering adulthood, afflicted by the usual woes of an insecure colony in a new world: economic uncertainty, a harsh climate, political instability. How easy, then, to blame the whole thing on witches, usually elderly, unpopular women who can easily be targeted and whose death brings a temporary satisfaction to the mind. Our earliest fairy tales often have this structure. Hansel and Gretel wander into the woods to search for food. The problem is hunger, compounded by the fact that their parents have to work at menial jobs and have no leisure to care for the children. But the story tells us that these very real problems are unreal, and that the real problem is a witch who lives in the woods and turns little children into gingerbread. Red Riding Hood goes to visit her grandmother, walking a long distance alone. The real problem in this story is aging and lack of care. The family lives far away, and grandmother is not doing very well. But quickly, the story deflects our attention. The problem is not this difficult human problem at all, requiring a structural solution. It's a single wolf who has broken into grandmother's house. In both stories, when the ugly villain is killed, the world is fine. Our love of an orderly universe makes these simple fictional solutions tempting. It's hard to wrap our minds around complicated truths, and it's far easier to incinerate the witch than to live with hope in a world that is not made for human delectation. Section 5, anger, child of fear. Anger is a distinct emotion with distinctive thoughts. It looks manly and important, not at all timorous. Nonetheless, it's the offspring of fear. How so? First, if we were not plagued by great vulnerability, we would probably never get angry. Lucretius imagined the gods as beings who are perfect and complete, beyond our world, and he said, they are not enslaved by gratitude, nor are they tainted by anger. If anger is a response to a significant damage inflicted by someone else on you, then a person who is complete, who cannot be damaged, has no room for anger. Judeo-Christian pictures of divine anger imagine God as loving humans and thereby as deeply vulnerable to their misdeeds. Some moral reformers have urged us to become like Lucretius's gods. The Greek Stoics thought we should learn not to care at all about what they called the goods of fortune. That is, anything that can be damaged by anything outside our control. Then we would lose fear, and in the bargain, we'd also lose anger. Philosopher Richard Sorabji has shown that Gandhi's views were very similar to those of the Stoics. The problem, however, is that in losing fear, we also lose love. The basis of both is a strong attachment to someone or something outside our control. There's nothing that makes us more vulnerable than loving other people or loving a country. So much can go wrong. In 1/2 year, the Roman philosopher and politician Cicero lost the two things he loved most in the world when his daughter Tullia died in childbirth and the Roman Republic collapsed into tyranny. Even though his friends thought his grief excessive and urged him to put aside grief and anxiety and be a proper Stoic, he told his best friend Atticus that he could not stop grieving, and what's more, he didn't think he ought to. Taking the measure of love fully means suffering. So the solution that wipes out both fear and anger with one stroke is not one we should accept. Keeping love means keeping quite a lot of fear. And though that does not necessarily mean keeping anger, it makes it a lot harder to win the struggle with anger. Fear is not only a necessary precondition for anger, it's also a kind of fuel to anger, feeding the four errors. When we're afraid, we jump to conclusions, lashing out before we thought carefully about the who and the how. When problems are complex and their causes poorly understood, as economic problems tend to be, fear often leads us to pin blame on individuals or groups conducting witch hunts rather than pausing to figure things out. Fear also feeds obsession with relative status. When people feel bigger than others, they think they can't be destroyed, and that calms them down. But when people protect their vulnerable egos by thoughts of status, they can also easily be goaded into anger, since the world is full of insults and slights. Indeed, Lucretius traces all status competition to fear, arguing that it's a way of soothing ourselves. By putting others down, we make ourselves feel powerful. And fear also feeds the focus on payback, since vulnerable people think that getting back at wrongdoers, even obliterating them, is a way of reestablishing lost control and dignity. Lucretius even traces all wars to fear. Feeling insecure, he said, we rage against what threatens us and seek to obliterate it. He omits the obvious possibility that war may be caused by a reasonable reaction to a genuine threat to our safety and our values, so we shouldn't accept his analysis fully. I am no pacifist, nor were my primary heroes of non-anger, Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela. Gandhi, I think, made a large mistake by endorsing total pacifism, but even just wars such as I believe the Second World War to have been, are often marred by zeal for the blood of the aggressor, and one could certainly argue that episodes such as the bombing of Dresden were motivated by payback rather than sound policy. Great leaders understand that we need to retain and fortify the spirit of determined protest against wrongdoing without comforting ourselves with retributive thinking. The brilliant speech in which Winston Churchill said, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat," refers to danger, to struggle, and to a willingness to accept great pain in order to preserve democratic values. It's conspicuous for its utter lack of retributivism. Churchill does not say that paying back the Nazis will remove the threat to freedom. Freedom is beautiful, and we must be prepared to suffer for it, but we must focus on defending what we love rather than disgorging our venom on the land, as Aeschylus' Furies put it. Churchill's speech is of a piece with the best Allied aims to rebuild Germany post-war, and we can now see the wisdom of that course as Germany is among our most valuable allies. Finally, helplessness and the fear that goes with that lead to this reflex I've talked about, in which we pin blame on someone in order to feel less buffeted by fortune and more in control. Even a long and difficult fight, a protracted malpractice lawsuit, divorce litigation lasting many years, is often psychologically preferable to accepting loss. Section 6, protest without payback. So what's the alternative? We can keep the spirit of determined protest against injustice while letting go of the empty fantasy of payback. This forward-looking strategy includes protesting wrongdoing when it occurs, but not imputing wrongdoing where there is instead the murky thicket of the global economy to manage, outsourcing and automation to reconcile with our citizens' welfare. Never seizing hold of blame as a substitute for a feeling of powerlessness, but also not yielding to despair. Even when we are confident in imputing wrongdoing to an individual or group, we can still firmly refuse payback, but look to the future with hope, choosing strategies designed to make things better rather than to inflict the maximum pain. So to conclude, I want to study just one example of protest without payback, the ideas of Martin Luther King, Jr., who contributed so much to our society's ongoing struggle with racism and its search for justice. King always said that anger had a limited usefulness in that it brought people to his protest movement rather than just sitting in despair. But once they got there, he said, the anger had to be purified and channelized. What he meant was that people must give up the payback wish and yet keep the spirit of justified protest. Instead of retribution, they need hope and faith in the possibility of justice. In an essay of 1959, he says that the struggle for integration will continue to encounter obstacles and that these obstacles can be met in two very different ways. Quote, "One is the development of a wholesome social organization to resist with effective, firm measures any effort to impede progress. The other is a confused, anger-motivated drive to strike back violently to inflict damage. Primarily, it seeks to cause injury, to retaliate for wrongful suffering. It is punitive, not radical or constructive." King, of course, was characterizing not just a deep-seated human tendency, but the actual ideas and sentiments of Malcolm X as he understood them. King insisted constantly that his approach did not mean acquiescence in injustice. There's still an urgent demand, there's still a protest against unjust conditions, in which the protester takes great risks with his or her body in what King called direct action. Still, the protester's focus must turn to the future that all must work to create together with hope and faith. King, in short, favors and exemplifies what I've called transition anger, the protest part of anger without the payback part. To see this better, let me now study the sequence of emotions in part of his I Have a Dream speech. King begins, indeed, with what looks like a summons to anger. He points to the wrongful injuries of racism which have failed to fulfill the nation's implicit promises of equality. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, he says, quote, "The life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination." The next move King makes is significant, for instead of demonizing white Americans, he calmly compares them to people who have defaulted on a financial obligation. America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check that has come back marked insufficient funds. Now here, I think, begins the shift to what I've called transition anger, for it makes us think ahead in non-retributive ways. The essential question is not how whites can be destroyed or humiliated, but how can this debt be paid? And in the financial metaphor, the thought of obliterating the debtor is not likely to be central. The future now takes over as King focuses on a time in which all may join together in pursuing justice and honoring obligations. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity in this nation. No mention again of torment or payback, only of determination to ensure the vindication of civil rights at last. King reminds the audience that the moment is urgent and that there's a danger of rage spilling over, but he repudiates that behavior in advance. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force, which was a Gandhi term that he had appropriated. So the payback is reconceived as the vindication of civil rights, a process that unites black and white in a quest for freedom and justice. Everyone will benefit. As many white people already recognize, says King, their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. King next repudiates a despair that could lead to the abandonment of effort, and it's at this point that the very famous part of the speech, "I have a dream," takes flight. And of course, this dream is not one of retributive punishment. It does not come out of the book of Revelation, actually, but of equality, liberty, and brotherhood. In pointed terms, King invites the African American members of his audience to imagine brotherhood, even with their former tormentors. "I have a dream that one day, on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words interposition and nullification, one day, right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers." There is indeed outrage in this speech, and the outrage summons up a vision of rectification which might easily have taken a retributive form. But King gets busy right away reshaping retributivism into work and hope. For how, sanely and really, could injustice be made good by retributive payback? The oppressor's pain and lowering do not make the afflicted free. Only an intelligent and imaginative effort toward justice can do that. It might seem odd to compare King to Aeschylus, though I think it's really not strange at all, given King's vast learning in literature and philosophy. They're basically saying the same thing. Democracy must give up the empty and destructive thought of payback and move toward a future of legal justice and human well-being. King's opponents portrayed his stance as weak. Malcolm X said sardonically that it was like coffee that has had so much milk poured into it that it's turned white and cold, doesn't even taste like coffee. But that was wrong. King's stance is strong, not weak. He resists one of the most powerful human impulses, the retributive impulse, for the sake of the future. One of the trickiest problems in politics is to persist in a determined search for solutions without letting fear deflect us onto the track of anger's four errors. The idea that Aeschylus and King share is that democratic citizens should face with courage the problems and, yes, the outrageous injustices that we encounter in political and social life. But lashing out in anger and fear does not solve the problem. Instead, it leads, as it did in both Athens and Rome, to a spiral of retributive violence. So back to Lucretius now. Lucretius tells a grim tale of human anger and fear gone wild. He imagines a world not unlike his own, in which insecurity leads to acts of aggression which do not quiet but only feed insecurity. At the time when Lucretius wrote, the Roman Republic was imploding, and insecurity mounting everywhere would shortly culminate in capitulation to tyranny. In an effort to quell fear, he imagines, people get more and more aggressive until they think up a bright new idea to inflict maximum damage on their enemies, putting wild beasts to work in the military. They even tried out bulls in the service of war. They practiced letting wild boars loose against their enemies. They even used fierce lions as an advance guard, equipped with a special force of armed and ferocious trainers to hold them in check and keep them in harness. It was no use. The lions, hot with blood, broke ranks wildly, trampled the troops, tossing their manes. And then in a poetic tour de force, Lucretius imagines the carnage that these animals unleash. Then he pulls back. Did this really happen, he asks? Maybe it happened in some other world out in space. And what, he asks, did those fictional people want to accomplish? To inflict great pain on the enemy, even if it meant that they would perish themselves. Lucretius' point is that our retributive emotions are those wild beasts. People may think anger powerful, but it always gets out of hand and turns back on us. And yet worse, half the time, people don't even care. They're so deeply sunk in payback fantasies that they prefer to accomplish nothing, so long as they make those people suffer. His grim science fiction fantasy reminds us that we always defeat ourselves so long as we let ourselves be governed by fear, anger, and the politics of blame. There is a better alternative. Aeschylus knew it, and King both knew it and lived it. Making a future of justice and well-being is hard. It requires self-examination, personal risk, searching critical arguments, and uncertain initiatives to make common cause with opponents in a spirit of hope and what we can only call rational faith. It's a difficult goal, but that's the goal that I'm recommending for both individuals and institutions. My argument has drawn on three prominent fields in the humanities. For evocative images that illuminate political problems and the path to political goals, I've turned to literature. In order to show how such goals have already been pursued in our own place and time, I've turned to recent history. But above all, since I'm a philosopher, I've turned to philosophy for critical analysis and structured arguments about justice, well-being, and the emotions. Philosophy does not compel or threaten or mock. It doesn't make bare assertions, but instead sets up a structure of thought in which a conclusion follows from premises that the listener is free to dispute. In that way, it invites dialogue and respects the listener. Unlike the overconfident politicians that Socrates questioned, Euthyphro, Critias, Meletus, The philosophical speaker is humble and exposed. His or her position is transparent and thus vulnerable to criticism. I say his or her because Socrates said he'd like to question women, if only in the afterlife, because they couldn't go out in Athens, so he couldn't get at them then. And Plato actually taught women in his school. Okay, so now you've seen the steps in my argument. Now, any one of you may jump in and differ with me, as Socrates recommended. And I do mean that. Since we're not having a Q&A tonight, do write me an email and question what I've said, and I'll try as best I can to answer. So that's how democracy learns and makes progress. I believe democracy urgently needs all three of the humanistic fields I've mentioned, which complement one another. All three offers practice in skills of mind and heart that are essential, especially in our current time of fear, resentment, and division, if our conversation with one another is to be respectful deliberation. But above all, to solve the political problem of anger, democracy, I think, needs to learn from, practice, philosophical dialogue, a way of conversing and differing about important issues that substitutes respect for arrogance and patient probing for overconfident boasting. If philosophical reason and its Aeschylean partner, legal reasoning and the rule of law, prevail over anger, we may possibly attain the result that Aeschylus imagines at the conclusion of his drama, that in plenty the blessings that make life prosperous may be made to burgeon from the earth by the sun's radiant beam. Thank you very much. So, do I stay here now?
Thank you, Martha, for that wonderful demonstration of the power of the humanities. It was just beautiful. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your support of the humanities and of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we look forward with great excitement to seeing you again next year. Thank you and good night.